Chapter 5. Larton ran without any real sense of direction. He hadn't explored much of the city beyond his own neighbourhood, but he knew every last inch of the area around the factory, all the alleys, roads, ruins and hiding places. If he had been thinking straight, he could have slipped away quickly and cleanly, or found a spot where he could hide until night. But Larton was in a panic. His best friend had been murdered in front of him, and he'd killed a man in response. His heart was pounding, and he fell often, scraping his legs and hands. His head was a bedlam of noise and terror. His only clear thought, run. If a mob had formed swiftly, they would have found Larton flailing around the streets outside the factory, losing his way and backtracking, an easy target. But the adults who answered the calls of the children were thunderstruck. They pressured the witnesses for detailed description of Traz's last moments. If anyone had thought to give chase, others would have immediately joined them. But in the chaos, everyone assumed that a group was already in pursuit of the boy, so precious minutes passed without anybody making a move. Outside, Larton had turned down a dead alley. He was looking behind him for pursuers, so he ran into a wall and fell with a cry. As he picked himself up and rubbed his head, he spotted a girl, no more than 4 or 5, sitting on a step and studying him. "What are you doing?" she asked. Larton shook his head. "You're hurt," the girl said. Larton didn't know what she was talking about. When she pointed at his head, he rubbed it again, looked at his fingers and saw that he was bleeding. Now that he was aware of his wound, pain kicked in and he grimaced. "My mummy can fix you," the girl said. "She fixes me when I get hurt." "That's all right," Larton croaked. "I'll be fine." "She gives me a cup of tea with sugar," the girl said. "Sugar," she repeated boastfully. "Have you ever had sugar?" "No," Larton said. "It's lovely," she whispered. Larton stared around. The worst of the panic had passed. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't feel so afraid anymore. He was still a long way from normal, yet he began thinking of what he should do and where he could go. He had to get away quickly, but he'd only be able to do that if he held his nerve. "Thank you," he said to the girl and headed back up the alley. "For what?" the girl asked. "Calming me down." "You're silly. Come back and play." But Larton had no time to waste on play. There was only one game of any interest to him now: beat the hangman. From the alley he took a right turn and had soon left behind the neighbourhood where he'd spent all his life. Though he wasn't sure of the surrounding area, he had a vague idea of the shape of the city and moved in an eastern direction. That was his quickest route to the outskirts. He didn't run, but walked briskly, head down, not making eye contact with anyone. Nobody paid attention to the thin, dirty, bloodied, trembling boy. The city was full of lost, wounded strays just like him. At the factory, someone had finally asked what had become of Traz's killer. When people realised the boy had escaped without even a half-hearted challenge, they were outraged. Nobody had liked Traz, but a rebellious brat like Larton Crepsley couldn't be allowed to stab a hard-working foreman to death and waltz away freely. A gang took to the streets and was soon joined by dozens of others as word of the murder spread. Life was monotonous in those parts, and a chase was a major attraction. Men, women and teenagers joined the workers from the factory, brandishing knives, hooks and any other sharp implements they could find. More than one also took the time to root out a good length of rope. Mobs were never shy of volunteers when it came to the office of hangman. By the time the mob was fully formed and storming through the streets, Larton was out of danger's immediate range. Their cries didn't reach him or alert any people he was passing. With no sign of a chase party, he was able to keep calm and carry on at a steady pace. It never crossed his mind to go home. He knew that was the first place the mob would look for him, but that wasn't the reason he avoided it. If he thought his parents would try to protect him, he might have returned. If he believed people would grant him a fair hearing, maybe he wouldn't have fled. If there was any justice in the world, perhaps he'd have thrown himself at the feet of his accusers and begged for mercy. But nobody would care about Verhorsten. Children in factories were killed all the time. As long as the owners made money, they didn't mind. But the killing of a foreman was a scandal. An example would have to be made to stop other workers from following Larton's lead. Larton's father was a thoughtful, caring man, and his grandmother loved him in her own way. But life was hard, and poor people had to be practical. They couldn't save him from the mob, and Larton didn't think they'd even try. He figured they would hang him over and curse him for being a fool and losing his temper. Larton had never heard the phrase, burning your bridges, but he would have understood it. There was no home for him in the city anymore. He was all alone in the world, and marked for death. It was evening by the time Larton cleared the city. The sky had been dark all day, and now it began to blacken with the coming of night. There was a cruel bite to the air. Larton had no coat, and he shivered in his short-sleeved shirt. He was hungry and thirsty, but the cold was his main concern. He had to find shelter, or he'd end up like one of the stiff, frozen street people he'd often seen. Hunching his shoulders against the cold, Larton walked along the main road for a while, then took a dirt track. His vague plan was to find a village and lay up in a cowshed or barn. He didn't know how long a walk it would be, but he guessed it couldn't be more than a few miles. If it hadn't started to rain heavily, Larton would have kept going. Maybe he'd have slipped along the way, twisted an ankle, and perished of the wet and cold in the open. Or maybe he'd have made good time and found shelter, stolen a few eggs in the morning, and set off in search of a job. He might have scraped by. Worked hard, earned some money. Perhaps he'd have lived a good life, married and had children, and died at the ripe old age of 40 or 45. But Larton's destiny didn't lie in a ditch or any of the nearby villages. Rain soaked him, forcing him to look for immediate shelter. A tree would have been fine, but the clouds looked thundery, and he'd heard tales of people who had been struck by lightning under trees. There were no caves that he knew of that left. Larton looked around, praying for inspiration, and through a brief break in the rain, they'd gone hoping to see ghosts, having heard tales of the headless horseman roaming the rows of graves. Of course they didn't see any. Ghosts mostly came out at night, but they saw plenty of monuments to the dead. The poor of the city were carted off to be dumped in mass graves, nothing to mark the spot where they lay. Those with money secured a grave. Wealthy people brought tombs. Graves and tombs were of no use to Larton, but some of the truly rich invested in family crypts, small houses for the dead. If they kept the dead dry, they could keep the living dry too, at least for a night. Larton didn't know if this small graveyard would boast any crypts, but on the off chance, he abandoned the path and splashed through the sodden fields, fearfully edging his way towards the home of the sleeping dead.